1984, George Will, columnist, wrote an article in the Washington Post about the miracle of Dunkirk. Some of you may have been familiar with this already. Maybe you saw the movie in 2017. It was a remake of a movie from the same name of 1958, or maybe you read the book by Walter Lord, The Miracle of Dunkirk, the real story of Operation Dynamo. It's a story from World War II when in 1940, the Allied forces were trapped in the small city of Dunkirk, France. 350,000 mostly British soldiers were trapped in Dunkirk, which is at the extreme far north of France. The German forces were making their way towards them and really had them hemmed in. Now, what the movie does not tell you is part of the story behind the miracle of Dunkirk. What happened was, as these Allied forces were feeling trapped and increasingly hemmed in, one of the British commanding officers sent a telegram to the British naval forces. And in the telegram, it was simply 3 words, "But if not." A clear reference to Daniel chapter 3. And what he was referencing was the story that we're going to look at in Daniel chapter 3 this morning. But what he was saying, without wanting the Germans to intercept any part of his message, he was saying to them, much like those 3 Hebrew youth in Daniel chapter 3, we feel like we're in a no-win situation, but we're trusting in a miracle. But if not, we'll stand until the end. And all of that was communicated in that 3-word telegram, but if not. What happened next is the miracle of Dunkirk. When that telegram came and word began to spread to the British and other Allied people, they rallied 850 what are called little ships. They were personal ships, they were cargo ships, they were fishing boats, and 850 of them eventually rescued 338,000 of the British soldiers. It is the miracle of Dunkirk. What I want to ask you this morning is, do you have a but if not kind of faith? We're going to be looking in Daniel chapter 3. If you have been in worship or Sunday school or vacation Bible school for any length of time, you're already familiar with the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or if you are a VeggieTales fan, Rack, Shack, and Benny. Continuing in our series called Unwavering, a study through the book of Daniel, learning some of the great testimonies of faith. We already saw in Daniel chapter 1 where Daniel and his 3 friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, stood without compromising their faith because of their convictions in their belief of faith in the Lord. God honored their faithfulness. We saw last week in Daniel chapter 2 where the pagan king Nebuchadnezzar had a dream that no one could interpret and he himself could not understand, called for all the wise men of the city, and no one dared to guess at what the king's dream might be. But Daniel had the courage to come before the king and say, I don't have the ability to understand your dream, but I know a God who does. And stood before him, pointing his finger in the king's face, saying, you'll reign for a minute, but there's coming another kingdom after you, and a kingdom after that, and a kingdom after that. And ultimately, there'll come a king with an eternal king that will reign forever, and that's not you. Now, it's not clear how much time has elapsed between Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel chapter 3. The Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. The Old Testament was written primarily in Hebrew. The Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. It dates back to 200 BC. In the Septuagint, the text says that the events of Daniel chapter 3 took place in the 18th year of King Nebuchadnezzar. That would mean about 15 years have elapsed. So, if that's so, enough time has elapsed where Nebuchadnezzar's short-term memory has kicked in. And in Daniel chapter 2, verse 47, Nebuchadnezzar pronounces God as the God of gods. But in Daniel chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar pronounces himself as God. And here's the story. Nebuchadnezzar has erected a 90-foot tall statue of himself. Now, unlike the vision in Daniel chapter 2, after which this statue is probably built, in the vision, the head was gold, the breastplate was silver, the waist was bronze, the legs were iron, but in Nebuchadnezzar's version of this statue, it is all gold. Now, this pagan king is arrogantly and defiantly saying, I will reign forever. I'm the king of gold. I'm the one whose kingdom is eternal. And he makes a 90-foot tall statue of himself and declares, as that statue makes its way through the city, when you see this statue, everyone fall down and worship me. A weird form of self-idolatry where Nebuchadnezzar has this image of himself twice as tall as our worship center. 90 feet tall. Now, when you look at it, it's 90 feet tall. Your Bible probably says 60 cubits. Cubits about 1.5 feet. So it's 90 feet tall and 6 cubits wide. So it's 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide. Now, the dimensions are oddly disproportionate from any kind of statue. You see 60 cubits tall and 6 cubits wide. Just for comparison, the Statue of Liberty, 150 feet tall and 53 feet wide. That's a 1-to-3 ratio. Christ the Redeemer in Rio is 124 feet tall and 26 feet wide. That's a 1-to-5 ratio. Big Tex. It's 55 feet tall and 12 feet wide. That's a 1-to-5 ratio. The tallest statue in the world, the Statue of Unity in India, 597 feet tall and 190 feet wide. That's a 1-to-3 ratio. Nebuchadnezzar's statue is a 1-to-10 ratio. That would be like a statue 10 feet tall and 1 feet wide. So it's kind of like a big gold Gumby. It's just this tall, skinny, weird-looking statue, and whenever it passes by, everyone is to bow down. Daniel is such a remarkable storyteller, especially as you read Daniel chapter 3, even though Daniel never appears in Daniel chapter 3. The storytelling is remarkable. There are a couple of things just kind of give you an idea of Daniel's genius. I want you to look, first of all, in Daniel chapter 3, look at verse 2, and I want you to see 8 different administrators, government officials that are delineated here, but not just here. Note Daniel 3, verse 2, Nebuchadnezzar the king sent word to assemble the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the chief treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, all the administrators of the province to come to the dedication. So you've got 8 different government officials who are also called. You see them delineated, all 8 of them in verse 2. Now look at verse 3. Then the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the chief treasurers, the judges, the administrators, the treasurers, all the provinces, he names them again. Then skip down to verse 27. He names them again, or at least a majority of them, and you go, why is he naming them 3 times? And it heightens the tension of the events that are about to take place as name after name of government officials are coming and bowing down. Not only that, I want you to note an interesting inclusion of musical instruments. Look in verse 5. After he has called all of the people, note verse 5, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of musical instruments. And you see 6 different instruments named there in verse 5. Now look down at verse 7. Soon as all the people heard the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, all kinds of instruments. Look down at verse 9. Then they began to speak to the king. O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every person who hears the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, all kinds. I'm not sure why the bagpipes are there. Apparently the Scots have infiltrated into Babylon. Bagpipes are there, didn't know that. You see it in verse 5, you see it in verse 7, you see it in verse 9 and 10. Look down at verse 15. Now, if you're ready at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of instruments, 4 different times, Daniel names all of these instruments, accentuating the pulse of the events that are taking place now. Mandated idolatry. Visualize the scene. A 90-foot-tall golden statue making its way through downtown Babylon. And when the music starts, 300,000 people bow down before it. Everyone in the city except 3 young men. The only reason we know 3 young men did not bow down is there are some Babylonian tattletales who are also there. Apparently, they were pretending to bow down, but they were also looking around. Kind of like those people in church that when the preacher says, bow your heads and close your eyes, they're kind of looking around, kind of doing like that. They're bowing down before the statue, but they're looking around, and in a crowd of 300,000 people, they are somehow able to identify 3 who do not bow down. And they call that out to the king. Verse 8, certain Chaldeans came forward, brought charges against the Jews. And then verse 12, they even blame Nebuchadnezzar. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the administration. So in a weird combination of jealousy and anti-Semitism, they blame Nebuchadnezzar. It's your fault. You brought these Jews here, and they don't bow down to your idol. Pick up the story with me in verse 13. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and anger, gave orders to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar began speaking to them. Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods, nor worship the golden statue that I've set up? Now, if you're ready, at the moment that you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of musical instruments, to fall down and worship the statue that I have made, very well. But if you do not, you will immediately be thrown into the midst of the furnace of a blazing fire, and whose God is there who can rescue you from my hands? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, Nebuchadnezzar, we're not in need of an answer to give to you concerning this matter. If it be so that our God whom we serve is able to rescue us from the fiery furnace and the blazing fire, he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we're not going to serve your gods nor worship the golden image that you have set up. Nebuchadnezzar was filled with wrath. His facial expression was changed towards Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And he answered by giving orders to heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated. He ordered certain valiant warriors who were in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in order to throw them into the furnace of blazing fire. Then these men were tied up in their trousers, their coats, their caps, and their other clothes, and they were thrown in the middle of the furnace of blazing fire. And for this reason, because the king's command was so harsh and the furnace had been made extremely hot, the flame of the fire killed those who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell into the middle of the furnace of the blazing fire, still tied up. Nebuchadnezzar the king was astonished, and he stood up quickly, and he said to his counselors, "Was it not 3 men we threw into the fire?" And they replied, "Absolutely, O king." And he said, "Look, I see 4 men untied and walking about in the middle of the fire unharmed, and the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods." We only know Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego because of 2 occasions. The first was in Daniel chapter 1 when they said no to compromise. The second is in Daniel chapter 3 where they said no to idolatry. They even get a shout out in Hebrews chapter 11 where the Bible talks about some will quench the fiery darts of the furnace, and that's probably a reference to these 3 men, but we only know of them here. Have you ever noticed in your life that sometimes God will use our faithfulness in small things to prepare us for what's coming later in the bigger things? And these same 3 guys who said no to compromise, they said no to the king's delicacy, they said no to the extravagance of Babylon in order to say yes to their faith. Now, emboldened by the courage that they had then, when faced with the temptation towards idolatry, their answer is equally emphatic: we will not bow down. And God used the courage of these 3 young men in what became a remarkable story of their faith. At some point in your life, you're going to have to decide where the line of no is. You're going to have to decide what are the things on which you will stand and where is the line on which you will say no. Because if there is no clear line of no in your life, it won't be long when you will find yourself bowing down to every Babylonian idol you face. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have a clear line in their mind. The king seems to remember them, despite the fact that word gets back to him that they have not bowed down. The king gives them a do-over. He calls them into his palace or wherever he happens to be set up. And he says to them, "Hey guys, maybe you didn't get the message. Maybe you didn't understand. Maybe you just need more time to think about it." That's sort of the implication in the Hebrew text. Do you need a little more time to think this through before I carry out a penalty? And the tension begins to heighten when Nebuchadnezzar gets to the end of his soliloquy, when he says to them, "If you do not bow down and worship this image, what God is there who can rescue you from my hands?" Might be one of the most important questions in all of the Bible. He'll get the answer shortly, but for now he uses that as a tone to try to encourage them, coerce them, to mandate them, and indeed their no is an act of civil disobedience. Don't use this as a proof text for suggesting that Christians should not be good citizens. Christians should be good citizens until the time you cannot be a good Christian. And at this point, their defiance of the king is because of a mandated compromise of their faith. And so the king goes through with his threats. It's not entirely clear where the furnace came from. I think this furnace was for melting down the gold. Remember, he's got a 90-foot tall statue, and he's at least plated all of that on the exterior with gold. That's a lot of gold. He probably, by the way, took some of that gold from the temple in Jerusalem. Now, to melt gold takes a temperature of 1,950 degrees. If you have a fireplace at home, your fireplace probably burns 500 degrees. This is 4 times that. Well, it began 4 times that, but now Nebuchadnezzar says heat it up 7 times hotter than that. I don't know if that means 7 times hotter than 2,000 degrees, or if merely that's some kind of symbolic way of saying make it really, really hot. Kind of like on a hot August afternoon after church when you go get in your car. That's how hot this is. Heat it up, hotter than it normally is. So hot, I'm not going to get close, but I will get some of my big, strong guys. So he enlists the valiant men, probably the trumpet section of the orchestra. He picks the big, strong guys that he's got, and their job is to throw these 3 into the fiery furnace. And the fire's so hot that when they throw them in the furnace, it burns up these valiant men who threw them in. And the king's command is so urgent, he throws them in. They've still got all their clothes, they got their hats, they got their belts, they got everything with them, and they're just tied up and thrown into the fire exactly as they were when they stood before the king. And all of a sudden, the real king shows up. Nebuchadnezzar gets up off his throne. Did you see that in verse 24? Look at verse 24 again. Nebuchadnezzar the king was astounded, and he stood up quickly. In the Septuagint, it says, he heard the sound of them singing. He got up. And he went as close as he dared, because remember, I'm not going to go very close because my valiant men just died. So he went as close as he dared, and he's first looking in, and he's counting. Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. And he counts again because, maybe he forgot, and he counts, and he says, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And then he asks a dumb question. He asks a really good question first. Now it's a really dumb question. Weren't there just 3? But they're not going to be sarcastic when they answer the king. Yep, king, there were 3. And the king said, look, I see 4. Now, theologians earned their money here. If you read commentaries, they have all kinds of pages about what's happening in verses 24 and 25. Some theologians, and I tend to agree with them, believe Nebuchadnezzar may have been the only one who saw the 4th in the fire. Emphasized by the personal pronoun, I see a 4th in the fire. And the 4th one looks like the son of a god. Now, I don't know how he knew that. I don't know if he'd ever seen a son of a god before. He's never seen the Son of God before. But all of a sudden, he sees someone that does not appear like everyone else. Now, when you look down at verse 28, later on he says, God sent an angel. His first guess was probably better, or at least closer, because he doesn't just see a son of the gods, he sees the Son of God. And I want you to notice that long before Nebuchadnezzar got off his throne, Jesus got off his. And in the middle of the fire, when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are there, they fall into the fire. The only time they fell down, by the way. And they fall down in the fire. And when Nebuchadnezzar builds up enough courage to go in there, maybe he heard them singing, but he looks in there and he sees a fourth, and he sees a Christophany. He sees a physical, tangible manifestation of Christ in the Old Testament, and he's there walking in the fire with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I don't know if Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego knew Jesus was there or if they saw him, but I promise you they knew he was in their midst. Because the only thing that burned up was what they did not bring with them. Babylonian ropes burned off, but their clothes are not burned. Their hair is not singed. They don't even smell like smoke. Been to a bonfire recently? Maybe you've been to fire pit back when they actually did fire. And you try to find that spot where the wind's not blowing, right? And you stand over here and the wind's blowing over here. So you go over here and the wind follows you. And it always seems to be blowing right where you're standing. And when you leave, what do you smell like? You smell like the fire you were just standing next to. And if you ever had actually been in the fire, you would smell even more like that fire. But all of a sudden, these three friends, they make their way through this fiery furnace, and when they come out, they don't even smell like fire. Notice, Jesus did not prevent them from the fire. He went through the fire with them. He did not keep them from the fire. He walked with them through the fire. And maybe they remember that verse in Isaiah chapter 43, when you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. Maybe they claimed that promise when they defied the king, but all of a sudden now these three courageous Hebrew young men realize that it is not the absence of trouble that gets you through Babylon, it is the presence of the Lord. Now Jesus walking in the fire with them, and Nebuchadnezzar still giving commands. Verse 26, Nebuchadnezzar came near the door of the furnace of blazing fire, and he said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, come out. You servants of the Most High God. Do you remember earlier, verse 15, whose God is there who can rescue you from my hands? Now in verse 26, he answers his own question. The Most High God. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and all of these government officials gathered there together for inspection, and they saw that the fire had no power over them. Nebuchadnezzar calls them out, begins to interrogate them, asking for evidence from his government officials, and responds in verse 28, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Note, please, he does not say, I will worship the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Nor does he say, I will tear down my 90-foot-tall golden statue of myself. But blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They frustrated my word. And then Nebuchadnezzar makes a very strange, almost comical pronouncement. He likes to make pronouncements. Verse 29, Therefore, I make a decree that any people, nation, or population of any language that speaks anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn from limb to limb, and their houses made a rubbish heap, because there is no other God who is able to save in this way. And oddly, now Nebuchadnezzar, who has just met the Most High God, offers to offer him protection. I'll protect your God. Just in case this God who's just rescued you from the fire cannot take care of himself, I got his back. Imagine how comforting that was for the Lord. I got his back. If anybody says anything bad about your God, I'll tear them limb from limb. That'll show them. And Nebuchadnezzar still does not yet understand he's not the one in charge. There's a statement of faith that stands out in the story. I wonder if you noticed it when I read it earlier. It's the statement of faith of 3 Hebrew young men who stand before the greatest earthly king of that day, defying his orders to bow down, making 3 statements of faith. Statement number 1, faith says, my God can. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to rescue us from the fiery furnace. Our God can. We don't wonder if our God's big enough. We don't worry about whether or not he's strong enough to save us from the fire. We worship a God who can. I want to introduce you to my God. My God is able to save me from the fire. I know who God is. I believe in who God is. I have full confidence in God. He is a God of no limitations. There's no power. There's no obstacle. There's no fire. There's no sickness. There is no trial from which my God cannot rescue me. My God can. Maybe today you need to be reminded of that. You have a loved one that's sick. You have a bill that you can't pay. You're waiting for God to reveal himself, and you need to be reminded that our God can. The deepest, most decisive question of our lives, quite literally, can be reduced to the common denominator: God can. Faith says, my God can. But read on in that same verse. Not only does faith say God can, faith says, I believe he will. These Hebrew youths said to Nebuchadnezzar, if it be so, our God whom we serve is able to rescue from the furnace of the blazing fire, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. We sometimes miss that part of the sentence. I believe God can. That's the intellectual part of our faith. But I also believe that he will. That's the actionable part of our faith. You see, every Christian believes theoretically in the first part. God can. But there's a difference between theoretical kind of faith and actionable faith. Theoretical faith says, I believe that if I walk out into that water, God could part the water and I could walk through it on dry ground. Actionable faith says, I will walk in. And these Hebrew youth said to that king, we know he can, and we believe he will. And so they say to that king, he will rescue us from your hand. I don't know if they understood that they wouldn't be burned by the fire, or if they would be somehow eternally rescued, or whatever they mean. They have enough faith to stand and say to him, we know he can, we believe he will. God's not on trial in Daniel chapter 3. It's the faith of these 3 men. I know he can, and I believe that he will. But there's the third statement of faith that I don't want you to miss. Faith says, my God can. Faith says, I believe that he will. And faith says, but even if he does not, I will still follow him. My God's able, and I believe that he will, but if not, I still trust him. You see, maybe that's the deepest part of our faith in God, so that I can still say yes to God even if God says no to me. I can still follow God even if things don't work out like I thought that they should, or I feel like that they would. I'm still trusting in God. He doesn't have to deliver me in order to demonstrate that he's faithful. Job Though he slay me, yet I will trust him. There's no presumption. God had not to this point promised he would rescue them from the fire. There's no negotiation. There's no reciprocal kind of faith. I'll serve God as long as he does this for me. I'll do this for him if he does this for me. Listen, we don't manipulate God. We worship God. We don't negotiate with God. We worship God. We don't follow God because God always rescues us. We follow God because he's worthy of our worship. The idea that if I just believe it, I somehow make it happen. Sort of a name it, claim it kind of faith that's common too often in our culture. Let me suggest to you what that is. That is idolatry wearing Christian clothes. I have no right to make God in my image or make an idol out of what I think God should do. I know God can. I believe God will. But even if God does not, I still serve God. We don't need more time. We don't need to deliberate. We don't need to get our heads together. If that be true, God can. I'm pretty sure he will. But even if he does not, we will not bow down to your idols. There are going to come times in your life where you're going to have to take a stand for your faith. God can rescue you. And by faith, we believe that God will. But the resolution of your faith is not trusting in God because God always rescues you. But when the fires that the earth brings against us grow hotter, we stand on our faith in an almighty God who is always faithful, who knows that sometimes not rescuing us in the fire is even better than coming through when we are. Maybe you're familiar with the phrase, your goose is cooked. You heard that phrase? Have you ever wondered where that phrase comes from? I'm going to tell you where that phrase comes from. It comes from the 14th century Czech theologian John Huss. Huss, the name, means goose. He would often sign letters by simply saying, the goose. John Huss was a 14th century theologian, began what became eventually the Reformation, stood for his faith, eventually burned at the stake because he would not recant his faith. And when he died, some of the people trying to mock him began to say the goose was cooked. But if you go to Prague today and see his statue, you are reminded of a man who stood for his faith and the commitment of his faith. The message still speaks today. Do you have a but if not kind of faith? The kind of faith that says, I know God can. That's not in question. I believe that God will because I trust him. But even if God does not, I will not. I'm sure I've seen it before, but it stood out to me this week. There were probably between 10 and 15,000 Hebrew youths that were taken now to Babylon. If in fact they had been there 18 years, this is after the final fall of Jerusalem, and all of the captives from the city are now residing in Babylon. That's why Jeremiah said in Jeremiah 29, build houses, plant gardens, have a family, settle in. You're going to be there 70 years. There were at least 10 to 15,000 of them who were residing in Babylon. How is it only 3 of them stood up when everybody bowed down? I'll tell you why. Because it's easy to be at ease when everything is easy. But the minute that the fire grows a little bit hotter is when your faith is going to be tested. The kind of faith that we find from Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael is a but if not kind of faith. John 11, Lazarus died. In the first part of the chapter, Jesus got word that Lazarus was sick. And the Bible says he dragged his feet. He delayed 2 days before he eventually went there. When he got there, Lazarus had already been dead a couple of days. First Mary and then Martha. Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. And there's a part of that that's true. If you'd been here, you could have prevented his death. If you'd been here, you could have stopped this before it happened. That's true. And I imagine Jesus smiling to himself. That's true, but you would not get to see what's about to happen next. And I can imagine Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego saying to Jesus, Lord, if you'd been here, we'd have never been in the fire. And that's true, but you'd never known that he could deliver you from it. See, if God always delivers you from every negative thing, how would you ever know he is faithful when you walk through it? David said, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, not fly over it, but I walk through it, and your rod and staff comfort me. Faith says, I believe he can. Faith says, I trust that he will. Faith says, even if not, I trust him.